The CareScape R860 operation, setting the ventilator data source. In this video, I'll be providing an overview of setting the ventilator data source, how to change the data source, and provide examples of when one may consider changing the data source. The data source is used to obtain patient monitoring parameters from either the ventilator or the airway module. In this clip, I'm just pointing out that my D-Light sensor is in place so I can obtain measurements from the airway module. How does one change the data source? What I'm going to do is I'm going to split the screen and I'm going to also zoom above the standby key. Above the time, you'll notice a little icon that looks like a wishbone. This represents the patient ventilator circuit, and this is the data source icon. So currently we have it set up where my data source, it's the ventilator data icon because I have two dots at the expiratory portion of my ventilator circuit. And we'll look at this in my split screens when I change my data source and see what it looks like when I am monitoring it with the neonatal flow sensor or a D-Light or PD-Light sensor. To change my data source, I'm going to select Menu on the top left-hand portion of the display under My System. I'll open up My System, and the first tab is Data Source, and it's currently selected as Ventilator. I'll select that of the choice between my ventilator and airway module in adults and pediatrics. I'm going to go ahead and select the airway module, and then I'll also have a choice between my D-Light sensor for my adults or a PD-Light sensor for pediatric patients. My first example when the device operator might want to change the data source is to look at pulmonary mechanics. I'm currently in my basic waveform page, so I'm going to move over to my split screen. And as you notice on the left side of my split screen under my pressure volume loop, I have my pulmonary section. And if you notice, a lot of them are dashed out, and the only thing I have is my dynamic compliance measurement and my PEEP measurement right now. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom into the pulmonary portion of the screen, and you notice on the right side there's my pulmonary section. Let's go ahead and change my data source. So I'm going to select my menu key, I'm going to select my system, and under my system I'm going to change my data source to the ventilator to the airway module and make sure it's on my D-Light. And I'm going to close this out, and you notice now I have a lot more pulmonary mechanics. This is just one example and when the device operator might want to use airway module monitoring versus the ventilator. Let's just zoom back into the additional information window, and you'll see that my icon for my data source has changed to show that the airway module is being used as my data source. And what we'll do is we'll go back into the system, we'll change the data source from airway module back to my ventilator, and you'll notice under my pulmonary mechanics, a lot of the information's dashed out again. Another example when you might want to change the data source is when you change out the flow sensor or troubleshooting the expiratory flow sensor. What I did is I split the screen so you can see the ventilator. And before I take out the flow sensor itself, I'm going to change to make sure it's on the airway module versus the ventilator. This way, when my expiratory flow sensor is removed, I can still get my measured values for my flow and volume. So as you notice, I uncovered the EVA. I'm removing my flow sensor. I do have a expiratory flow sensor alarm. However, I'm still getting my measured values from my D-Light sensor at the patient Y. Now let's go ahead and replace the expiratory flow sensor. I'm going to put it back in line, and once I do this, my alarm message will go away. The last example is changing my data source in neonatal mode when I calibrate the neonatal flow sensor. As you can see, my icons for the neonatal flow sensor, I'm going to go under my menu, and I'm going to select my system, and instead of my neonatal flow sensor, I'm going to select ventilator. This allows me to still measure my flow and volume while I'm doing my neonatal flow sensor calibration. I do get an alarm message that the neonatal flow sensor is not in use as a reminder. I'm just going to calibrate the flow sensor, and my flow sensor is going to be calibrated, and I'll just put this back in line.